I'm Simon Baddeley. The first work I had was studying American beer drinking habits. Um, Shortly after that, as a lowly research worker, I did field work on board merchant ships, and I went on to do graduate work at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And when I came back to England, I got a lecturer's job at the Institute of Local Government Studies at Birmingham University. And I brought to that what I'd learned about management and organisational development. But not long after I joined the Institute, I became absolutely engrossed in learning about working relations between elected politicians, managers, and professionals in the process of making government. And that's been my interest all my working career. I've extended that work via seminars and presentations in Canada, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand. I've run courses on relationships between cabinet and senior officers in local government with Sir Michael Lyons, and I've taught scrutiny skills to local government politicians. I've worked with NHS trusts, again looking at the relationship between the political dimension of that and the management one. And I worked with civil servants from Iraq, India, Africa, Japan, and Romania. And I worked in Australia and New Zealand on the same subject. In that fascinating process, I've developed a variety of teaching methods and written a number of papers. The one I'm probably most known for is one I co-wrote with Professor Kim James called Owl, Fox, Donkey, Sheep, Political Skills for Managers. And we'll be dealing with that a little bit later. But I've also overseen a video archive, films I've made myself, in which I've managed to persuade politicians and managers to have conversations, not so much about how they work together, but to try and capture them actually working together and to look at the nuance by which trust is constructed across the political, professional and managerial boundaries. I've studied this subject for darn near 40 years, I reckon, and it continues to engross me, and I hope I'll be able to engross you as well. Almost by chance, I came back to England and got a job at the Institute for Local Government Studies at Birmingham University, where I was brought in because I was considered, among others, to be good on the subject of management. And management was interesting public servants a lot more in the 70s. It was something that under Harold Wilson in the civil service, but also in local government, with big reorganisation in the early 1970s, management was becoming fashionable. And so I contributed with my knowledge and skills on that subject on a variety of training courses and consultancies. And I'd been at the Institute, probably several years, and was working with other people who were also steeped in management, of whom one was Professor Kim James, who was a co-author of the paper that I mentioned before in my introduction. And we had the most wonderful boss, Professor John Stewart. He was the husband of a politician, Teresa Stewart, who became the leader of Birmingham City Council, a woman of great integrity, only died very recently. And both she and John were fascinated with the whole process of government and deeply committed to local government in the case of both of them. But John also knew that management was the way things were going, not just professionalism. And the way he managed us was the most unbureaucratic, the most unauthoritarian. He would do his work by popping his head round the door and saying something and getting into a bit of a chat. And then about 2 weeks later, or maybe a bit earlier than that, it would hit you what he'd been trying to say to you. And he popped his head round our door Kim James and mine, and someone else called Tanya Arroba, who I work with a lot, well, good friend, and said, have you ever thought, with all the work you do, how politics enters into the procedures of government? And I remember thinking, I was a little bit puzzled. Well, we all were. And he said, one of the things that you don't mention in management, that doesn't come into management theory very much. And there's one thing that particularly I think you might have missed out on. Do you know what it is? And he smiled in his gentle and pleasant way, and bubbles appeared above our heads, which would have had question marks in them. And he said, after we looked appropriately dumbfounded and unclear, but without any element of criticism, he said, the vote. Do you know what it feels like to have someone put their cross by your personal name and put that ballot paper into a slot? Do you know what it feels like to, you stood for an election? Do you know what it feels like to be elected? And then he left. And we pondered for a bit. Yeah, we knew we got a message. And it was from there that our thinking about, which led a few years later, about 18 months later, to Kim and I producing this paper, Owl, Fox, Donkey, Sheep, Political Skills for Managers. And from that, of course, came many other issues. And I'd only add to that, one of the first things I learned when I started to study this subject and think about it with my colleagues was that Max Weber, who I was well familiar with because, of course, he appears a great deal in management theory, and in particular, the person who first gave the most serious attention to the idea of bureaucracy, the concept of almost a machine-like, highly rational organization of human beings into connecting means to ends. And he wrote a paper in 1921, which I'd read as an undergraduate. It was part of being educated was to know about the great German sociologist Max Weber. But I went back to that and looked at his thinking about bureaucracy, and then came across another paper that was written in 1919, but didn't actually appear until after the Second World War. Sorry, frog in my throat. And it was called Politics as a Vocation. And it's also a famous essay, but I hadn't come across it. But what interested me about that essay, which has got many fascinating things in it, you may well have read it. He said that the relationship between democracy and administration creates one of the most profound sources of tension in the modern social order. And that really stuck in my head. This idea of a profound source of tension between the processes of democracy and the processes of bureaucracy. Not least, and I'll finish here on this particular point that I want to make about the sources and the origins of this paper, Owl, Fox, Donkey, Sheep, is that bureaucracies are a brilliant way, with all the problems that have been revealed in them because they're staffed by human beings since Weber wrote his essay, is that they're the most brilliant means of connecting means to ends. But what Weber went on to say is that, of course, they don't determine ends. They are the great maker of means, connecting the means to that end. As we thought about ways of teaching the subject of political awareness, political sensitivity, including teaching ourselves, by the way, uh, we reckon we could work with two dimensions, and one of those is the reading dimension. Uh, if you read well, you're politically aware. If you don't, you're politically unaware. So it's not just about awareness, it was about what in politics are you aware of. And we reckon that would be being able to read an organization's decision processes, its overt and covert agendas, the location and bases of power inside and outside the organization, your own power base and abilities to influence, exercise influence on the basis of what you know about your power base, and a feel for organizational culture and style and political purpose, political direction, and of course, in government, the difference between small p politics and large p politics. An important distinction there. And we call that the reading dimension. And we developed various ways of inviting people to map their political landscape. We called it, we developed a survey, sets of questions. Often the people we were working with could do that better than we could. But we would say, what were the kind of questions you think are important to know the answer to? So it was almost like, tell us things you don't know as well as the things you do know. And so I've got quite a lot of these for all sorts of different situations. But so if we were talking about, say, civil service, I might say, what is the political representation of your ministerial team? What's the spectrum within the party? That's a party political dimension, if it's a coalition. What variances and similarities are there between your Secretary of State and their ministerial colleagues? And you might want to know the same about the different agencies that you're working with, because government is a multi-agency setup. What's the character of change in your political environment over a year, from the Queen's Speech? How do you define short, medium and long periods within government? There's often very different senses of pace and time in different organisations. What are the general intervals, as you understand it, between reshuffles, frequency of agenda shifts? Is it a 5 or a 6 day week? Red box activity? Policy surges? What weighting do you place on other government departments and the three power breakers, number 10, the Cabinet Office and Treasury? Those are just some suggested questions that have come up in my discussions with senior civil servants about the sort of things that you might need to put into your map of the political environment. And then the second dimension, which is just as important, is we thought about this, is what you carry into that political landscape, into the carrying dimension. And we struggled with what we would put at either end of that dimension. We started off with the idea of good and bad, and then I think Kim or me said that's getting a bit theological. So we came around to thinking of the concept of integrity, which is a widely used term and translates in many cultures. And then on the other hand, we had psychological games, more of that later. So what are you carrying into your political landscape? What are your beliefs, your values, your personal views? And we thought that you could, for instance, read a political landscape extraordinarily well, but when you're actually in it, having to say something, having to listen, having in various ways to be involved in doing work in that political landscape, how do you handle that? So depending on your emotional state, but also the values, including implicit biases, by the way, which has a lot of airtime at the moment, what are you carrying into that? So you can, as I say, have a great understanding of the situation and still feel unable to handle it, or maybe thought beforehand that you could handle it and you could perform well and do what you need to do. And then when you got into it, you found that what you were carrying was different from what you had thought. I sense this all the time when I'm giving a talk. I'm thinking of it now. What I carry may be helping me or actually acting in a very negative way in terms of maybe quite a shrewd ability to read the setting in which I am. So we put reading and carrying together. And on either end of those dimensions was integrity and psychological games in the case of carrying, and political awareness and political unawareness at the ends of the reading dimension. So now we've got the two dimensions, reading and carrying, crossing each other. And that gives us quadrants. And it gives us spaces where we can talk about different kinds of behaviours, depending on what you're reading and what you're carrying into a situation. So if you take the bottom two, which is inept and innocent, innocent goes into a situation but is politically unaware. And as a result of that, pays the penalty for their unawareness. And in doing that, the tendency is for them to blame themselves for what happens. Whereas if you go to the quadrant on the left-hand side, inept, here's someone stumbling around a darkened room, blaming the furniture they bump into in the darkness that isn't lit up for them. And so innocent is saying, I forgot my torch. Inept is saying, why isn't there any light? If you go to the higher two spaces, behaviours up there, wise and clever. Wise is politically aware, enters into the situation aware of what's going on, being able to answer a lot of those questions, to map the political landscape, and seeks to conduct themselves to their best ability. We like the word wise. It translates, it's lasted for centuries and it translates into many languages. And it's about not only advancing yourself, which you may in the process, you remember if you're wise, everything else comes with it, King Solomon, but that you basically are committed to trying to better the situation that you're in. If you go to the other side, you're equally aware of what's going on, you're politically astute, but your primary motive in that space is to use the information that you have about the political environment to advance yourself. You're mainly concerned with both self-preservation and self-advance. Pretty simple ideas. And of course, these are not, as I say, personality types. These are behaviors between which we can all rubber band, depending on what the situation is. So one could walk into a situation feeling terribly well briefed and confident, and then realize that you completely misread it, that you're actually rather wet behind the ears, as the saying goes. Or you could walk in a situation wet behind the ears, thinking, I don't understand any of this, but primed to learn, and you pick it up as you go along, and you actually begin to operate in the wise part of the quadrant, or the clever, depending. And of course, you can treat this as a terribly simple model. That's the whole point. I mean, every good template should be pretty straightforward and make a lot of sense. I mean, ABC, the alphabet, you can write Romeo and Juliet with it, but 26 letters, it's pretty straightforward once you've learned them. And so this simple idea is capable of, I believe, and I hope you'll find, vast elaboration. The Northcote-Trevelyan report was prepared by Stafford H. Northcote, who was later to become the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and C. Trevelyan, Permanent Secretary of the Treasury. And it was about the British servants, civil service, and it was commissioned in 1853, published in 1854. 28 concise, superbly written pages, which introduced the concept of a permanent civil service to which people were appointed through examination. And I cannot tell you how important this is in thinking about the tension that Weber, much later than this, described between democracy and bureaucracy. The paradox is that to be politically neutral in the permanent civil service, you have to be extraordinarily politically sensitive, politically aware. And that paradox fascinates me. I hope I can show why it creates one of the great issues for you in learning about how to exercise political sensitivity in government. It was novel. There was no great barrier between politics and administration prior to the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms. It had been referred to. There was a long recognition that there was a need not to have an enormous retreat of civil servants, administrators, every time there was a change of administration. So the need for a permanent civil service as part of the efficiency of government was recognised by many. But it wasn't until Northcote-Trevelyan reform came that we began to evolve and develop that idea of the politically neutral administrator in a permanent civil service. And it does create a tension. And that's why I define that notion of political space, and I'm going to define what I understand by politics at the moment, and then administrative space, which I could define as professional space. Leave out managerialism for the moment, because that comes a bit later. But prior to the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms, it was perfectly normal for what we now derogate as cronyism, old boy networks, favoritism, nepotism, giving jobs to your cousins, was actually seen as a perfectly normal way to get a post in government. And that's how you lobbied. You sought a post in government through making approaches to somebody senior in government. Either your family did it for you or you did it. And there was not thought to be anything wrong with that. And indeed, there are some countries even now where that's how things work, naming no names. But for over 177 years now, we have tried very hard to maintain that difference between a permanent civil service and democratically elected governments, which can change, both in form and in party. So, if that's one source of tension, which I'll go into in a moment, we can then introduce another source of tension in both the cases of professionalism and politics. In the introduction into government during the 1950s, long presaged through the success of managerialism in the private sector, in private enterprise, in government, particularly through the Fulton Report in 1958 under Harold Wilson. So if you look at these spaces, I think they're fairly straightforward, but I'd define what are the characteristics of each one and then say the point about what you're having to do and where you have to try and operate in that wise part of the owl, fox, donkey, sheep model, is to be able to operate where these spaces overlap, where the tensions exist. So let's just take politics, which you must have studied this over and over again, but I'm just going back sort of Ladybird Book 1 version. Politics is about who gets the wealth, where and when. That's one cynical version of it. Politics is about the mobilization of power to make or resist choices about how we shall live. Politics is the authoritative establishment of value. There's not a person in this country who doesn't have some idea of what's meant by habeas corpus, even if they don't use the Latin. They know what that means about their rights, or they have a sense of that. Politics is about the legitimization of force. Politics will allow you to be a murderer and to make that both heroic, legitimate. The defining of community, who's them, who's us, nation. It's about public discourse, debate, discussion, and the acknowledgement of fortuna, of luck in the affairs of human beings. Machiavelli introduced this idea of fortuna, and I think, Napoleon said, I don't just want good generals, I want generals who are lucky. And so those are things which management and professionalism seek to eliminate from public affairs. Management doesn't say if we're lucky, the budget will balance. If we're lucky, this project will succeed. The politician may well be thinking that way about the nature of luck in human affairs, the paradox of unintended consequences. Now, if you take professionalism, professionalism involves being in an occupation that requires specialist training in the liberal arts or sciences and offering a salaried career, very unlike a political career. It means you're accredited by a collective body that guarantees your probity and reliability. It means you're highly trained, you're disciplined, you're competent in your demeanor as well as your knowledge and aptitudes. It defines problems in terms of the solutions the profession is qualified to offer. I'm not an expert in that area, but I am in this area. Preferences for party political neutrality, with practices based on scientific inquiry and technological inventiveness. Now you take managerialism, which is a relatively new cousin to government compared to professionalism and politics. Managerialism would argue that the state, wherever its boundaries are drawn, must be superbly managed. This course, after all, I think is about enhancing management within the British Civil Service. There must be a focus on efficiency and effectiveness. Those are very important terms. Value for money, and the idea that state administration must be audited, analysed, made accountable, be transparent. Management claims to operate outside politics, yet it also has theories about leadership, about motivation, about human organisation, about personality, and indeed about governance. And it also regards politics as a whole as an interference in the rational procedures, as indeed does professionalism. The other thing about management is its relentless optimism. You hear managers talking about the management of a disaster, the management of catastrophe, the management of crisis, the management of loss, the management of bereavement. There's a faith within this managerial space that there's nothing that cannot ultimately be managed: money, time, health, personal relationships. Now, if you're seeking to operate wisely in the terms of the owl, fox, donkey, sheep model, one of the things you may need to read over and above what you carry into that situation is, where are you in the places where those different spaces with their different values and procedures and understandings of the world overlap?